Tēnā koutou katoa, Marky here with day 6, blimey, it's gone quite fast, of my book review challenge. Now this is a really interesting one. I mean, this is the problem with doing this as the challenge, is that they're all books I've read some time ago, so if I was sort of specifically going out my way to do a book review, it would be a book that would be fresh in my mind, but this is one I haven't read for a little while, and I've just been having a look through it to refresh my memory, and there's so much more in here that I can actually remember from the first time reading it, so this is something I'm definitely going to read again at some point. So I hope I can kind of do justice to this, and I might even do a follow-on review a bit more in depth. So, Unholy Hungers, Encountering the Psychic Vampire in Ourselves and Others, by Barbara E. Hort. Okay, now I am very interested in lots of weird things, but don't mistake that for me being gullible or credulous. Is that the right word? Credulous? I have an interest in lots of woo-woo subjects. It doesn't mean I kind of go around believing things. I have a very open mind about everything, as I said before. So sometimes people think, you into lots of, you've got some weird beliefs and you're into some weird shit. Well, I'm into weird shit in a theoretical sense, but actually I'm quite a skeptical kind of person, really. So I'm interested in the concept of psychic vampirism, okay, sometimes called energy vampirism, which is like, think about energy suckers, people that suck your energy. So it's something I've read a lot of books on, and I've got a lot to say about. I'm building up for an epic video. I'm going to put it on Patreon because it's far too woo-woo for general consumption, about psychic vampires. Because I've got lots of thoughts on this, some of them a little controversial actually. So this is one of the books that I ordered. I think I got this from Amazon or eBay a few years ago, to feed my unholy hunger for information on this subject. However, it goes off in a different direction, really. But a very, very interesting one, okay, as I've found a couple of books on this subject do. Okay, so there are, there's a couple of videos where I've touched on this. So see my video on narcissism, and I did a response video to people that were claiming that narcissism was synonymous with demonic possession, which I challenged in the video. And I think what's happening is people are confusing something called narcissistic supply with energy or psychic vampirism. They're using some of the same language. Okay, so a narcissist will. So some of the psychology and some of the research around narcissism says that effectively they feed off people. Okay, but essentially, generally speaking, they're feeding off people for approval, and that's known as narcissistic supply. Okay. And that has been likened to being a psychic vampire. And I think this is partly because the word psychic has two different meanings, which I also talked about in another video. I can't remember which one though. So the word psychic, would associate, most people probably would associate the word psychic with, telepathy, fortune telling, clairvoyance, mediumship, all those kinds of things, and people would be very right to do that. That would be a very accurate way of looking at the word psychic. But the word psychic is also used in psychiatry and psychology and psychotherapy. Not so much now as it used to be, and mainly in the psychoanalytical, psychodynamic schools of psychotherapy. So Freud talked a lot about psychic energy and things like that, and he wasn't talking about anything, he wasn't talking about mystic meg. Okay, he was using the word so psyche actually means soul. Okay, so this is a book that is using the concept of the psychic vampire more in the psychological sense. Okay, because although the word means soul, this is where it gets complicated. The word psyche means soul. The word comes from the Greek myths. there is but it's come to mean mind, basically. So that's why we have psychiatry, psychology, psychotherapy. Okay, so the word either means so how can we narrow these definitions down a little bit? So psychic can either mean a kind of a mystical or unexplained transmission of information to a person without recourse to the five senses, or it could mean anything pertaining to the mind. Okay. So, psychic vampire, what they mean here in this title really is somebody that feeds, the psychology of feeding on other people. Okay, so it's talking more about things like narcissistic supply than it is talking about energy vampirism. I've done a video on psychic energy as well. So when we're talking about psychic vampirism, what we mean is we don't mean vampires who are psychic and can tell your fortune. Well, what psychic vampirism or energy vampirism means, that it's somebody that will steal your energy, will suck your energy from you. Okay. So, sorry, there's lots of different terminology and it all gets very kind of confusing. I hope I've clarified that. If not, I'm more than happy to do more videos on this, and if you've got questions, I'm happily respond in a video. So this is a book about the psychological kind of side of it. Now it's written by, see if I can kind of show you a little picture of the author. I always get in a mess when I try and turn the camera around to show you things. So Barbara E. Hort, PhD, and she's a doctor, not a medical doctor, but she's got a doctorate, and she's a Jungian counsellor. Okay. Or Jungian, I should say, pronounce it correctly. So that's worth explaining as well, to put it into context. What does it mean being a Jungian counsellor? So it's the first time I come across the term Jungian counsellor, actually, because normally you have, if the word Jungian is applied, it's usually a Jungian therapist or a Jungian analyst, most of the point. Carl Jung was a disciple of Freud. He was also a disciple of Nietzsche, which people kind of often don't take into consideration. And he used Freud's embraced psychoanalysis, which was invented by Freud, and then developed it further into something called Jungian analysis. Although it's a bit of a myth that he kind of, people tend to think that he threw away, through all of Freud's work, threw the Freudian baby out with the bathwater. He didn't. He continued to use a lot of to work in a very Freudian way throughout the rest of his career, but he also created something called Jungian analysis, and sometimes he would use Freudian analysis, sometimes he would use Jungian analysis. And Freud was an amazing man. Freud was an amazing man, but Jung was an amazing man, and he came up with lots of things that very few people give him credit for. So, for example, he's the first person to develop the terms introvert and extrovert, and he was pivotal in the development of the 12-step movement. He wasn't directly involved, but the main founder of AA was a patient of his, and it was something very significant that Jung said that actually led to the foundation of the 12-step movement. So yeah, and Jung is famous for archetypes. So Jung, not so Jung, Jung, not Young. People call him Jung sometimes, which really annoys me. Jung. He was Swiss. And one of the things that many things that he's famous for is archetypes and the collective unconscious. The collective unconscious is often something that's very misunderstood. People think that the collective unconscious means that we're all connected on a psychic level, psychic as in more on the mystic Meg side of psychic, which I think is true, but that's not what Jung was getting at. What he was getting at is that there are psychological blueprints, if you like, and images that he thinks all human beings from all cultures and probably from all time, throughout the whole evolution of humanity, that we all relate to on some level, and he called them archetypes. Okay, so the reason I'm going into this level of depth in kind of setting the context that she's a Jungian counsellor is that so things like metaphor and symbolism is really key to the Jungian approach. Okay, so they're very big on dream analysis. So Freud was very big on dream analysis. Jung was very big on dream analysis, but approached it in a slightly different way, and was of the opinion that there are certain universal images and universal metaphors that kind of it's almost like we're pre-programmed with them, and they have a kind of a universal meaning. So it doesn't necessarily mean that, like with a dream, these little dream dictionaries, if you dream of fried eggs, it means your ears are going to drop off. That's not quite what it means, but that's the kind of the Jungian approach, really. So I suppose the simple thing to take from it from this is looking very deeply at images, metaphors, symbols, and not just, and ones that endure, so kind of and ones that are universal. Okay, so and it's just a theory, you don't have to go along with that theory, but it's a way of looking at things which can be certainly very interesting. It's a fascinating kind of world, the Jungian world. So what this book is about, okay, it's not about energy sucking, although I think it touches on that. It's about so it looks a lot at fiction and the vampire of TV, movies, fiction, novels, and what that might actually come from, what that's drawing from. Okay, so she talks a lot about the novel Dracula, but she also talks a lot about a lot of other literature as well, and films. She talks about the I say The Silence of the Lambs. That started off as a novel, didn't it? So it became a TV series, didn't it, and a film and stuff later. Sorry, I keep flicking through the book. That's what, if I look distracted, I'm just looking at it. It's fascinating. It's kind of looking at it as I talk. But it also talks about, draws on other things like Dorian Gray. I think it even mentions Star Wars at one point or another. But the reason I like this book so much is the conclusion that she comes to, which is, I think, is brilliant. Okay, absolutely brilliant. Is where do all the kind of tropes, horror movie or horror fiction tropes about vampires come from, and do they have a deeper meaning? And I think from reading this book, yes, they do. Okay. So although she doesn't use the word, I don't think she actually uses the word narcissist, or certainly not a lot. I think she might be. My memory was that she was talking mainly about psychopaths with this, but I don't want to. I don't want to put that book down. It's distracting. I don't want to misquote her or do her a disservice, really. So what she's talking about is things like, so vampires, okay, so think about all the tropes of the kind of classic kind of vampire, okay, so generally speaking, they can't go out in the daylight. Generally speaking, they can't see their own image in mirrors. Generally speaking, they feed off the blood of the living. And there's a few others, and we may touch on them as we get further into this, or we may not really. And she's comparing this to a narcissist who is not sucking your energy, but is basically a narcissist. So narcissism, okay, and I'm using narcissism in the clinical definition, okay. So I'm not talking about somebody that's vain and and just kind of puts lots of selfies up on their social media profiles. Talking about a classic narcissist in the clinical sense, which is somebody that tends to see other people as extensions of themselves, that tends to have a sense of entitlement, can tend to grandiosity, has very highfalutin fantasies, can be prone to envy and jealousy, can be prone to rage, and essentially seeks approval like a fish needs water. Okay, there's a big overlap between psychopaths and narcissists, but the easiest way to kind of tell the difference between the two is psychopath doesn't care what people think about them, but a narcissist cares deeply about what people think about them. Okay, so I mean that's very simplistic, but that is quite a good little kind of ready reckoner field guide rule of thumb. Okay, so think of people that you think, oh, who would you kind of call it? So think about I always think of Tony Blair. I used to think Tony Blair was psychopathic, but actually narcissistic, very, very eager to please, very anxious about his image, very, that kind of thing. The other thing that's kind of universal to psychopaths and narcissists is a kind of a what they call superficial charm. So they're often very kind of charismatic. So here we go. So you're starting to see maybe how these kind of things fit with the vampire analogy, is that vampires are often considered hypnotic, charming, seductive. You kind of if a vampire was to come into your room, you would be rendered defenseless by the mesmeric effects of the vampire. That's what happens in the films. Okay, so that represents that according to this author would be a metaphor for the what they call the superficial charm. So often narcissists are very charismatic, but it doesn't run very deep. Their feelings don't run very deep. So that's why people often fall for narcissists, because they can be, particularly initially, very charming, very charismatic, very seductive. Okay, so feeding on blood, that's the first one, that's the easiest one to deal with. So the way that a vampire feeds on the blood of the living is the way that narcissists relate to other people. They don't see other people as individuals in their own right with thoughts and feelings and the need for fulfillment. They see other people as resources or as extensions of themselves. So the narcissist's children will be bragging fodder. Or it could work the other way. If the narcissist children misbehave, then that would be horrendous for the narcissist. The narcissists find that very difficult to, if their children behave in a way that the narcissist doesn't like and therefore feels sort of shamed by. So we've all met people that kind of constantly bragging about their children, but then actually they don't really there's something very unhealthy in the way that they treat their children. It's not that they nurture their children, it's not that they're even particularly interested in their children, apart from as a shop window for themselves when their children are successful. So that's the kind of the blood sucking part of the thing. So a narcissist can suck you dry and spit you out. So a narcissist can be very charming, make you think that they can be all over you like a seductive vampire, but once they fed from you, they could you could be dead to them, really. Sometimes they'll keep a long-term relationship with somebody if they're a long-term supply of approval, and sometimes they'll kind of move from person to person, kind of sucking them dry, emotionally, mentally. So what is it about vampires not being able to see their image in mirrors? Well, one of the things about vampires, and particularly one of the things that this author talks about, is or one of the things about narcissists is they can't self-reflect, they can't introspect. It's a very frightening thing, because essentially the core of narcissism is a deep emptiness inside, which has been with a huge overcompensation. So the grandiosity is an overcompensation, a defence, if you like, for a very low self-esteem. That's why the Wizard of Oz is often used as an analogy for narcissism. Okay, they can't bear daylight because narcissists don't want to be seen in the light of day. They don't want their true selves to be seen. It's all about image and projection for a narcissist. So this would kind of fit with narcissists that are very abusive in their families, but they would present as the perfect family. the house would be brilliant, the car would be, a really good car, and cleaned regularly, and the children would all be very polite, and they'd all go to church, and they'd all do and say the right things. But actually, the quality of life for those children would be, horrendous. So they don't like to be exposed. The thing about going out in the day is about exposure. Exposure is toxic to them, and they can't see themselves in the mirror. So yeah, I think this is fascinating. So this book covers a lot more than that, as I've just realised through glancing through it again. But I suppose that was the bit that struck me the most when I read it, and I think that's absolutely fascinating. And makes sense as to why we're so captivated by the vampire thing, the whole vampire mythos, and how it's developed these this particular form, with the mirrors, with the daylight, with the seductiveness, the hypnosis. Oh, and the other thing as well is vampires are to be invited in. Hey, a vampire can't come into your house unless you invite them in. So like a narcissist, in order for a narcissist to use you for supply, on some level you have to consent to that. Okay. Now the chances are you're going to not really know what you're letting yourself in for, but on some level you will make some agreement to see them or to spend time with them, or you'll willingly give them approval on some level, at least at some point. And then once the vampire is in your home, you regret it and you want them to leave. So I'm sure there's some more actually. I want to do some more stuff on vampirism. I want to do some stuff on movie vampires, and vampire lore. I want to talk about the whole thing about staking vampires in another video. So I'm going to do another video on that. I might even do that now. And for Patreon only, I'm going to do this very revealing. I'm slightly anxious about kind of sharing some of my controversial theories around the whole psychic energy vampire thing, but also I'm quite excited to do it as well. So brilliant book. If you're interested in, if you like horror fiction and gothic fiction and stuff like that, as I do. I mean, I'm a goth. I love all that kind of stuff. You'll enjoy this book. If you're interested in narcissism, and if you're interested in the toxic relationships, and if you're interested in the kind of subtleties of life, what lies behind things, I think this would be a very enjoyable book. And I think it's a book that would be of interest to authors, or people that are people that are students of literature, as much as it would to people that are interested in psychology. So yeah, definitely not for everyone. Okay, but definitely, if you're interested in that direction, a really good read. So if you do decide to get a hold of that, enjoy. Rangi Mario.